Okay, let's do it. Get the verbiage flowing.
Am I putting on this lavalier?
Yes, exactly. You're putting that in my kind
It's called a lavalier.
A lavalier? Lavalier?
Call it that if you want.
Okay, yeah, I'm not in the industry. I don't know anything about anything, really.
Which industry?
I don't know.
Penny.
Got a big shadow there, but that's good. Chiaroscuro. Keep it natural.
This is your natural habitat up here.
Okay, let's roll it.
I don't even know what the questions are. What we know things.
We know some things.
This guy has a lot to say. I mean, I can't even remember the name of the album because he made it so many words.
Shall I check to see what it is? Let me check. Let me get it right. It's booting. Or it's coming through. It's a little slow here. In the Cabinet of Wonders with Schop and Scheidmann, I think is what it's called. But I need to get that right, don't I?
In the Cabinet of Wonders, music for organ and violin from 17th century Hamburg.
Well, in the Cabinet of Wonders with Scheidemann, right?
I don't see that on there, but
okay, that's what we're going to call it. You introduce yourself.
Okay.
Just do the hair.
I'm Martin Davids, and I play violin.
David Yearsley, organist.
We're the Davidians.
Yeah, we have had various times, thought about names, but of course we have David Yearsley and Martin Davids, so we were thinking about the Davidians, but that probably doesn't fly in the post-Waco period.
It doesn't matter if it flies.
So this record that we are very excited about is coming out from False Azure Records, January of 2025, we hope, because we're going to meet again in February to launch this in person. This record called In the Cabinet of Wonders with Scheidemann and Schop, music for organ and violin from 17th century Hamburg. That's a long title, but it looks great on the cover.
Do we remember what the year was?
More than 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago, we were both invited to participate in a recording. It was a last-minute recording put together of North Italian music of the 17th century, including some ensemble pieces. And I was playing a little box organ by Klopp, a few stops, a fluty little thing that we transported to this church in central New York, a place called Cortland, New York. And Marty was in the band. He was, I don't know, were you the concert master?
I was, yeah.
Yeah. And I had not met him then, and of course he's got a captivating violin sound and approach. And I noticed that he was adding, we were playing Monteverdi and Castello, and he was adding some fascinating ornaments. And at one of the breaks, he came over to the organ, and I was fooling around, and then he just started playing along with whatever I was doing. And we made a little bit of music, and that was it. We hit it off right then.
Yeah, and then we discovered that we liked talking to each other too.
Yeah.
And we just became friends and decided to try to make some records together.
I made a recording called All Your Cares Beguile, songs and sonatas from Baroque London. And that also included reimagining of arias and songs, transcriptions, our settings, our creative engagement with other music of the past, as opposed to just playing from a score. We did some of that too, but we have always, I think, tried up from that initial encounter to bring something of our own, call it personalities, our own imaginations to the music.
Also, like one violin and one organ isn't a typical ensemble, so there's a lot of room for me to take on some of the lines in an organ score, for instance, unique ways of hearing music for the organ. This is only the second album. We've done a number of concerts in between. We're both really busy and live far apart, so we have to really make an effort to get a date together to do a big project like that.
Yes, and that's precisely how this session here came to pass. We're at Notre Dame in South Indiana for a concert of this program, Schop and Scheidmann in the Cabinet of Wonders. This is not the organ we recorded that program on, which is at Cornell University, a Baroque style organ. that was finished some 10 years ago, but rather a similar kind of instrument. But we have to enjoy each other's company and joint music making when we can. And here we are, a little closer to Marty's hometown of Skokie as opposed to where I live, which is in Ithaca, New York. Schop and Scheidmann, yes, the great SCHs, the sh's. Schop and Scheidmann, they were both from Hamburg, which was the biggest city in German-speaking Europe. It was a great cultural center. It had been spared the catastrophes of the so-called German War, the 30 Years' War, which ravaged Germany, killed a third of the population, some places even more, in the first half of the century, from 1618 to 1648. Hamburg remained untouched, and so this vibrant culture was not impacted, did not suffer, and so this kind of music making, the organists were paid, they could continue to practice their craft. And Heinrich Scheidemann was the organist at the Church of St. Catherine's, one of the many large churches in Hamburg with massive organs. He presided over an organ at that point that has been recently rebuilt from an earlier instrument by Gottfried Fritzsche, one of the famous organ builders then living in Hamburg. And incidentally, it was also a place where Johann Sebastian Bach in 1720 played his most famous organ recital, of which there are glowing reports that survive. That was some 70 years later, another couple of generations. But that organ already in the 17th century was big. It was even bigger than this one. It had 4 manuals, different divisions of the organ that were spatially unified but also distinct. All kinds of different stops, flutes, recorders, brass instruments, trumpets, crumhorns, a massive pedal division that really buttressed congregational singing but could also be deployed for free works, and we hear some of that kind of thing also on the recording. So really just a massive pre-industrial synthesizer that has essentially unlimited, indeed infinite, practically infinite possibilities. And in that space around the organ, he was joined by his friend, his dear friend and fellow employee of the city of Hamburg, Johann Schop, who was a civic musician, and they were longtime collaborators and in fact renowned not just in Hamburg but across the region, across German-speaking Europe. Visitors were sure to hear them play. They made a point of it. It was a tourist destination. Poets remarked on the incredible collaborations of the two. Prolific poet Philipp von Seesen in a 1651 poem said, "When Schop and Scheidmann marry their art, melancholy flees." That was characteristic of both men. Especially Scheidemann was renowned for his wit, his good humor, his fast fists, his fast fingers. But Schop was, aside from being one of the first important, well-known violinists, because the violin was still a relatively new instrument, only 50 years old, let's say, by the time Schop picked one up, having been invented in Italy and then exported to other parts of Europe. He published some of these very interesting works that you hear on the recording in a collection called Het Uitnemend Kabinet, the Sublime Cabinet, the Sublime Kunstkabinet, the place where you store all your treasures from around the world to display. And one of the treasures in this case are, of course, sonic. And Schop produces very interesting Italian sonatas, sonata-like pieces, but also variation sets. And we hear those. There's continuo, an organist is accompanying or participating in it, but it's really prestige violin music of the Renaissance, of the mid 17th century.
Yeah, and he's really into like the fantastic style.
I mean, you play a solo piece too. You should talk about it, because is that the first solo published piece, certainly in Northern Europe, right?
I mean, there's not a lot of, as I've said earlier, music just for violin and organ, and we don't really know exactly what the two of them were playing up in the loft. But we can assume that a lot of it was Schop's music. A lot of it is variations pieces, so we can imagine, as we did on the record, the organ trying out different stops in each variation to color the mood or affect of each one. But really the violin is, he just lets loose with whatever his mind comes up with, and it's a very interesting mind. It's not easy to predict what's coming up. He doesn't need to stay in one meter. He doesn't need to keep the harmony the same. He does whatever he wants, and there weren't any rules. He just lets fly with his imagination, and it's enjoyable to go on these journeys with Schop. I mean, certainly being heard is a challenge because the organ is such a gigantic instrument, and it can make so much sound. Really, I'm only playing one note at a time, usually. We've definitely found that the violin timbre cuts through, depending on the stop you're on. One of the things we love about it is that sometimes it sounds like the violin is just one of the stops on the organ. An organ stop that has a lot of color and nuance.
Yes, and the organ we recorded this on at Cornell has a viola da gamba stop. Of course, it's not a violin stop, but there's a stop on this organ that also tries to do that. Of course, you would never mistake this, or you're unlikely to mistake this as a violin, but that kind of attempt to mimic string playing is also characteristic of what organ builders were trying to do in this period in the 17th century when there was an explosion of different, call them color stops. This is what it sounds like here. Does that sound like a violin?
Not really.
It's a little noisy. That's the attempt, I think, to evoke some sense of the violin.
Same or noisy.
Well, you know, somehow, I think that's, you know, that stop has a little more noise in a good way. I mean, noise is a good part of organ stops. They should have some texture rather than being this completely smooth, silken sound. There's got to be something human in them. I can completely drown him out if I want to. If I pull every stop out on this organ, you're not going to hear any violin. You'll just see this figure in the concert that we're playing tomorrow. You'll just see this figure miming violin playing and seeming to do nothing. So yeah, one can take it obviously too far. But on the other hand, thinking back to that first encounter more than 20 years ago with a little box organ, which of course doesn't have much power and has these very demure, retiring flutes. We want to resist the temptation simply to have the organ be in the background, because that clearly was not how this music was perceived by those great admirers of the pair back in their own lifetime in the 17th century, but rather to try to push it to exploit the rich colors of the organ in ever-changing concert with the violin. So we do use reeds, these kind of nasal stops. And if you hear a little too much organ by the standards of accompaniment as often conceived of nowadays, well, maybe you just have to live with it. The other point I would make is that there are many different places to hear the organ. Obviously now we're sitting up in the organ loft. We've got this part of the organ, the rook positif, which shields the organist and whoever else is up here from the congregation or the audience in this case. Then we've got the main part of the organ above us. So we're in our own little world here. And in the 17th century too, patrons, especially prized guests, were often invited up into the organ loft so they could hear the violin. Let's say if Schop and Scheidmann, again, this very famous celebrated duo for a visitor or an important aristocrat, let's say in Hamburg, to hear, they could be invited up there. So they would be hearing something rather different. The organ might be playing these color sounds, but they're going over the top of the head. So more intimate listener, so to speak, would have a much different access to the violin. So the organist would, of course, pull stops accordingly, not necessarily worrying so much about who's listening or not down in the hall. But of course, for a concert like tomorrow, we do have the audience, so we have to figure it out. Again, trying to push the parameters of what we think of as a duo, you know, that the organ should really not be accompanying, but really a collaborator with the violin sound.
Yeah, some of the music I'm playing part of the organ part.
Yeah.
So it seems silly to have the violin dominate that type of composition. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, when we made a recording, we don't have all the same issues in terms of listening, because with microphones, we can mic the violin more for certain movements if we feel the balance isn't right.
Yeah, we did some of that. So the microphones, like these cameras, become the top donors, the platinum pass, so to speak, to the organ loft in St. Catherine's Church in Hamburg in 1650. In, as they said, auf der Orgelempore, in the organ loft. The luxury box, you know what I mean? The luxury box of the 18th century. Who knows if there were schnapps and perhaps a bit of beer, maybe some Baltic Sea herring.
I think any music you play has to be imbued with who you are. This music is so specific, and I think the first challenge was just understanding the music, because it's so different from what we normally play. I mean, there's a piece that just doesn't even have a title. So what does he mean by that?
Even in the original print, I think in the modern edition of it, it says sine titulo, but I think in the original print it doesn't even have that.
It's probably just blank.
Yeah,
exactly. I just threw it down. Yeah. That makes more sense, yeah. Mm-hmm. So once I felt like I had an understanding of the music, then I just try to bring it across. And I don't feel inhibited by what he wrote or didn't write, or I don't feel like I need to add a ton of my own notes. But we do definitely add some notes.
Yeah, we try to depart from the score in various ways, but
just figuring out the patterns that are in the music and trying to communicate those clearly so that people will hear them and be interested in them.
And you're right, there are many chestnuts, classics, greatest hits of the 17th century. We do a motet in tabulation by Heinrich Scheidemann, that is to say a setting, a cover, if you like, of one of the most celebrated motets of the period by Giovanni Bassano, Venetian musician, called Dic Nobis Maria, which was, again, a real hit. It's originally just for organ. Scheidemann doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and so we integrate violin into that, as could well have been done by Schop and Scheidmann. And then we also do the Spanish Pavane. We end the program with the Spanish Pavane, which is kind of a dance till you drop classic, which of course has some slower moments, but is really a relentless display of the incredible virtuosity and inventive powers of Johann Schop, with Scheidemann playing chords, drawing on the organ's sonic resources, but to more of an extent, he's in the background because the real display, the extravagance is with the violin. And that piece is interesting too, because those are changes, it's a chord progression that every musician of the 17th century with any training would have known and been able to play. If one showed up in Bergamo in northern Italy, hey, let's do the Spanish Pavane, that could be done. But if you look at it actually and listen to it, what Schop does with it, he departs really from the standard changes, a bit like Charlie Parker taking a jazz standard and putting in a lot of substitute chords. So you really have to think about what Scheidemann is doing, as Schop is just going really off-piste with a lot of these things. And that's the kind of the unknown, unbounded imagination, even within these classics, these standard tunes, the greatest hits, that Schop, he cannot be contained by the expected, even in a tune that everyone knows.
How much license did they have? It's hard to imagine Schop composing music with any sort of rule book at all. If he had a teacher, he didn't really listen to any rules that were passed down. Yeah, like you said, he takes a standard tune and he deviates from the harmony whenever he feels like it. Whenever his line he wants to take his line somewhere, that's where he's going. There's no rule against that. And a lot of pleasure can be gained from going where he wants to go. And I view him as an example of someone to emulate, and just to not restrain ourselves and think that we have to do things a certain way just because that's what everyone does.
Obviously, there are great musicians who lived in that style and developed this relationship, playing every week, several times presumably together over many, many years. And that, of course, fosters the kind of freedom that we see in, call it, vestigial form on the page from Scheidemann. So we want to try to capture some of that. I think we tend to be too tepid also in the way we use the organ and worried about everything being correct. St. Catherine's was a big church, and as Thelonious Monk said, there are no wrong notes on the piano. So you just, of course, we're trying to make sense of this and be convincing, also have fun with it, of course. But it is, the 17th century. There's texture, there are mistakes, there's grit, and we need to enjoy that, right? I think we enjoy that, yeah. Scheidemann and Schop, their lawyers are not coming after us.
Yeah, well, we may be able to freely perform their music and do whatever we want to it, but if we wanted to just play whatever we feel like, we would just write our own music. I want to play what he wrote and sort of play it how I would play it, but it's not like a rewrite. I don't need to change it into something else. It's great the way it is. Back then they knew what authorship was. It wasn't an unfamiliar concept. I don't think they had a legal system to enforce it like we do now. They weren't ashamed of attributing things to other people and saying, this is what I did with this popular tune that someone else wrote. They didn't have to claim everything as their own. Why would you? Playing by yourself isn't that great. It's much better to play with other people and be inspired by others. There is a passage in this prelude by Schop that I just can't make sense out of, so I've expanded it a couple measures to make it, in my mind, sound better, more coherent. And I don't know if anyone notices.
Right, the
He's
AI,
not going to come back and correct me.
the bot at Apple Music is going to listen very carefully and say, hey, you added 2 measures. This is, this is now an arrangement by Martin Davids, not simply the work itself.
Better, then I can get those royalties.
It's true that they did have a sense of authorship in that quite sumptuous publication of the 1640s in 2 parts, It Outnehmen Kabinett, the excellent, the sublime cabinet of wonders. Schop, his name is there quite proudly. And again, this first published violin music, part of the projection of his own prestige, his own sense of his importance in not just Hamburg, but Northern Europe, Amsterdam being really the center of music publication, one of the centers of publication in the period. So yeah, I think we like to imagine that if Scheidemann and Schop were his, they say, oh, yeah, I like what you've done with my stuff. Of course, we're never going to play it like, exactly like them, and that wouldn't be the intention if, in fact, we were their colleagues in Hamburg in 1650.
I mean, I contend that if you had 2 people, the same violin, and the same piece of music, there's no way that they could play it the same as each other.
Right.
It's not even possible.
And nor desirable.
I shouldn't feel like I need to do it exactly how he would do it. Mm-hmm. I may play it in a way that he would prefer. I don't know. He may hate it. As someone that writes music, I'm happy to hear what someone does with things I've written, because I don't know everything.
about your own work. Yeah, once you set something into the world, people are free to go after it. So yeah, I think that perhaps too, maybe it sounds egotistical, but people listening to this record might be liberated to do some things, or better things than what we've attempted in it, just freeing themselves up to, when necessary, depart from the score, add some bits,
and we feel
be
that
themselves.
way.
Yeah,
I mean, any record is just a snippet of time.
Yeah,
you can't change it. So anything you think of later, you can't put back on there, but you can do it in a concert.
Yeah. The concert can be different than, obviously, and more textured than what we produced on the record. We had a lot of fun making it and listening to it in playbacks too. It's vivid, I think of these guys. These were men with goatees, and Scheidemann, the famous engraved portrait of him, has these very dashing curls. He was like one of the musketeers. He's like a 3 musketeer of the organ, just embracing the moment. In spite of he lived in a time of war, but still there's something irrepressibly optimistic about this music. Even when, there's also the moment of turning to melancholy, because if you're going to be a musician of standing, you have to set Dowland's ever popular Pavane Lacrimae, and he does that too. But there's a quality in that music too, some very eccentric passages that speak, maybe not to optimism as represented in the music itself, but some spark. All the music is simply, is basically, it's not a solidified thing. It's a platform for performance. There's that wonderful moment in when you're doing these things, when you just get rid of all the old stuff. You're unburdened of it.
I mean, definitely, you pick your favorite ones, and whenever you're improvising or ornamenting something, you're taking a risk, and sometimes you don't succeed. So those aren't necessarily the ones that make it on the record, but they may have some cool ideas in them.
Yeah. And one thing we do in our performances is, and there are many accounts of this from the period, is that the tuning is not a separate thing. You don't play one note and the violin and get that note and then move on to the next, but rather the organist improvises a little intonation, an intonatio, that the violinist then finds the pitches and tunes the violin to that. So you have a little bit of music rather than the music has stopped and we're tuning and then we're going to return to some sort of musical discourse. We try to get rid of that. Of course, that can be confusing, especially in a concert, because is that the tuning or is that the piece? It's not that the intonation is riveting music. That's not its intensity. It's just useful for that, but doesn't stop the program. So people get lost. What are we in Scheidemann? Is this anyway? We added one of these to the at the last minute. We thought, well, why don't we do one of our little tuning things? So we just did one take, and it's called intonatio, and I started on some chords and had a few scales and figuration as Marty got around his violin and followed me through that. And I think there's one little lick that I did that it just has a glaring grazed note. You know, it's just, it's a wrong note, but it was our only take of that sort of thing. And I thought, hey man, we got to have the mistake in there anyway. A cynic might say, you've just added that before to you know, you added that in post-production to make it seem like it was spontaneous.
No need for that.
Yeah, so that also speaks to the idea of mistakes and taking risks, even if they're not the greatest risks. I mean, this is just music, you know?
Yeah, no one's gonna die.
It's good. Okay, all right.
Seriously, enough talking.
Okay, all right. Excellent.